Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Taylor Carnevale. I'm an executive fellow with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research in the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program team, or ICARP, as we like to call it. I'm joined today by my team members, Nikki Caravelli and Sydney Short, that you'll hear from later in the program today. This is the last webinar in our Adaptation Planning Guide workshop series. For those of you who may not have background, the Adaptation Planning Guide provides guidance to local governments on local adaptation and resiliency programming, and it's hosted online at the ICARP Adaptation Clearinghouse. The link to that online resource will be inserted into the chat. For those of you joining us for the first time today, though, this webinar can very much be an individual resource for climate adaptation planning implementation. Before we begin on the actual content, I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Nisenan people. It's important to recognize and respect Indigenous people and their longstanding presence in this territory, and I encourage you to do the same. We're going to include a link to nativeland.ca, which is a really cool resource where you can identify kind of where you are and the Indigenous peoples that have inhabited that land. We encourage you to include your name, organization, and where you are joining us from in the chat. Perfect. So a quick overview of our agenda this morning. We'll begin with an introduction and an overview of the Adaptation Planning Guide Phase 4. And then we'll have a speaker panel. We have 3 speakers joining us to talk about different aspects of the implementation process. And then we will close out today's webinar with a question and answer portion. Please, throughout that time, use the chat for questions. We'll go ahead and revisit those during the question and answer at the end of our program. Also, closed captioning is available. If at any point you're having any issues accessing closed captioning, please message Sydney Short in the chat. So as I mentioned, today we're covering phase 4 of the APG, implement, monitor, evaluate, and adjust. An aspect of that is funding and financing. And as we've moved throughout this process, there have been kind of guiding themes that we've picked up along the way. So those are equity, start, center, and lead with equity, build it into the budget very on in the climate adaptation process, make it relatable, incorporate case studies and storytelling, humanize the process, kind of bring it beyond the climate science, community engagement, make the process interactive and collaborative with a wide range of stakeholders, plan alignment, use plan updates as opportunities to align priorities and policies across multiple plans and sectors, and best available science. Use the most up-to-date, locally specific science available as you move throughout the climate adaptation planning process. So before we get started, we wanted to hear from you. As I introduce implementation and kind of the core themes of this webinar, we'd love to hear what actions, keywords, or feelings are coming up for you. What do you associate most with climate adaptation strategy implementation? You are welcome to join via www.menti.com. The code to participate is 5257-7407, which has also been included in the chat. If you have a smartphone, you can also go ahead and scan this QR code, and I will move shortly to a screen where we can see where everyone is at and what everyone's coming up with. So I see challenging, impatience, progress, air quality, how, resilience, expensive, funding, long-term opportunity, address, respond, community, necessary, real, heat mitigation, air quality, equity, controversial. Thank you all for contributing. These are amazing. collective action, coordination, collaboration, optimistic, sea level rise. I really think these are kind of a show of how expansive this phase is and how much it kind of brings in for folks and all the considerations that are important throughout this process. So I'm hoping this can frame our discussion moving forward, both in kind of overviewing phase 4, thinking about what was brought up for you and how the APG can serve as a resource to kind of address those needs and feelings and thoughts. And especially as we move into question and answer, I invite you to kind of bring these ideas into the question and answer and see how our speakers' work may kind of be interacting with these actions and keywords. So moving into our content today, again, we're covering phase 4, implement, monitor, evaluate, and adjust. Phase 4 has 4 sub-steps within it. The first is the actual implementation effort. So putting the adaptation strategies that were created from phase 1 to phase 3 into effect. Monitoring is the second sub-step, collecting information about how the implementation has been proceeding and ideally reporting that information publicly. With monitoring comes evaluation, that key third step, which is reviewing the data and determining if the adaptation efforts are building resilience as planned or if they aren't being effective. The fourth sub-step is adjustment. So revising the adaptation efforts as needed to get results that the community wants and needs. Since communities will likely need to revise their adaptation planning efforts at some point, the adjustment phase can act as a trigger to go back and begin the process again after several years. And of course, as we've highlighted throughout this entire series, outreach and engagement should be a component throughout all steps, both in this process and specifically in phase 4. As you might expect, the hope is that this phase will help communities put their adaptation strategies into effect and give them the tools and resources to measure progress and ensure that adaptation strategies remain effective going forward. So these are some questions that may kind of be an interesting part of the process and be super important. So how can communities implement adaptation? Who can support adaptation efforts? What indicators should be monitored to track adaptation performance? How do we evaluate how well adaptation efforts are working? How do we revise strategies? Things to consider for the implementation process are building on existing processes. So bolstering or altering existing programs that have already proven effective within the community and building on internal strength and capacity. Assessing cost effectiveness. So the project team should evaluate each implementation method for cost down to the department and staffing requirements. Cost benefit assessment is a way to compare measures to determine the most cost effective option or a sequence of measures that starts with the most fiscally feasible. The third is leverage community and private sector alliances. Aligning strategies with local community groups and private sector entities is a good way to ensure ongoing effectiveness. It's also a way to limit cost burden by delegating aspects of implementation to an external entity. And then the fourth is establishing partnerships regionally. So geographic boundaries should not constrain adaptive actions, and some adaptive actions require regional collaboration. One of our speakers today will touch directly on this aspect of the implementation approach. So the APG outlines kind of a multitude of funding and financing sources. So these can include local general funds, bonds, taxes, assessments, fees, grants, private sector partnerships or investments, nonprofit grants and partnerships, amongst many others. Financial models can be based on a variety of funding sources, analytical methods, and strategic motivations. Local agencies often rely on their general fund for partial or full funding of implementation. The upsides of that is that it allows for more direct control, and using it does not rely on local ability to receive grant funding or raise new capital. In cases where a community does not have the funding necessary to implement all adaptation strategies, it can be helpful to rank strategies by how important it is to enhancing climate resilience and by the local capacity to fiscally support implementation. Strategies can be classified based on whether current support of a strategy would require no budget adjustment, reallocation of funds, or new and/or external funding. And of course, kind of as we've reiterated throughout this series, community and stakeholder engagement should be a very expansive and thorough part of the climate adaptation process. It should also be equitable. So make sure that everyone who's being impacted by the planning is being kind of incorporated into that process actively and is a valued partner throughout that process. Yeah, and in addition to the project and core teams, that process should also include frontline, vulnerable, and tribal community representatives. And now I will pass the mic to Nikki Caravelli, an assistant planner with the Office of Planning and Research. She will touch briefly on the California Comeback Plan and then delve into the resources OPR has for this step in the climate adaptation phase.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Taylor. I'm just going to do a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, awesome. So in outlining this phase, we just want to reinforce that we do recognize that the state can play a very important role in this space. And so piecing together funding, implementation mechanisms, and consistent monitoring programs does require resources. And so we're excited to announce that the governor has proposed in the California Comeback Plan a couple of key provisions for funding for community resilience measures, including resources that could serve as valuable support in all of our adaptation and resiliency planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation efforts. So the first one up on the screen is $25 million for climate adaptation and resilience planning grants. This one-time funding would help fill local, regional, and tribal funding needs, provide communities the resources to identify climate resilience priorities, and support development of a pipeline of competitive climate resilient infrastructure projects in every region of the state. The second piece I want to highlight is $5 million allocated in the plan for a vulnerable communities platform and to supplement CalAdapt mapping. This would support investment in actionable tools like the new platform and support better state coordination on climate science. And all of this, of course, underpins our state resilience investments. And then finally, we have included here in the plan $22 million for the fifth climate change assessment, which will focus on turning science to action by looking at climate impacts by region and sector, as well as doubling down on the legislature's priorities of protecting public health and safety, reducing risks to vulnerable communities, and building economic stability in the face of climate change. So just want to reinforce really quickly that these, of course, are all just proposals, which are currently being evaluated and negotiated by the legislature from now until about mid-June, and that's when we'll hopefully see a finalized budget. Next slide, please. So just want to highlight a couple of resources that will hopefully help you at the local level as you're going into the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation phase. We, of course, have our interactive version of the Phase 4 guidance on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. We also have a topical page solely dedicated to investing in adaptation, so it pre-filters all of the resources in the clearinghouse for those that are most relevant to funding, finance, and investment. We also have a couple of case studies focused on this topic, and also some case studies focused on aligning different plans in order to facilitate implementation. Next slide, please. Couple final resources to highlight. A couple years ago, ICARP worked on a climate finance and adaptation investment in California ebook. We also at OPR have a federal grants resource. So you can sign up for a newsletter and receive, I think it's weekly updates on federal grant opportunities coming out of the Fed. And there's also a number of different webinars that we coordinate and partner on and publicize through that program. Next slide, please. And finally, if you haven't checked out the California Grants Hub, that's the best place to find all information on California state grants and filter by relevant topics like, I think, environmental justice and natural resources, et cetera. And then California's fourth climate change assessment included a number of technical reports, and two of those in the governance technical reports section of the site focus on implementation and financing and addressing challenges within that space and different strategies to address them. And I think I might have seen some of the authors of these reports online. So if you're still there, hello, and thank you for your contributions. And then finally, Civic Spark, just to continue to beat that drum of what an amazing resource Civic Spark is, as well as Climate Action Corps, they're still accepting project partners and fellows. So apply as soon as possible if you want the support of Civic Spark or Climate Action Service Fellow. I think that is all for my slides. So now I'm going to kick off our speaker panel. We have 3 lovely speakers today here who will talk about some of their local efforts to begin implementing and building on their vulnerability assessments and adaptation strategy frameworks. So our first speaker, Carrie Whitlock, joins us from the city of Elk Grove as the Strategic Planning and Innovation Program Manager. Carrie, take it away.
Thank you. Sorry, taking me a minute to get, okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and you can see my slides hopefully in slide view. So as Nikki mentioned, I'm Carrie Whitlock, the Strategic Planning and Innovation Program Manager for the City of Elk Grove. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about our Community Mobility Resilience Plan that was actually adopted by our City Council just in February of this year, after about 18 months of development. It was funded, so the project was actually funded through Caltrans Adaptation Planning grant. And the goal is to plan for the local impacts of climate change on the transportation system. And what we did was develop both to identify how the city will be affected by climate change through the 21st century, and also to provide a set of strategies to help us mitigate and adapt to those impacts. And these strategies, while the grant was from Caltrans and it was focused around our transportation sector, it included strategies to help with building a more resilient built environment, to looking at a climate ready community and improving social and economic resilience. So it didn't
So the plan focuses on 3 core areas related to climate change. So 2 of these focus areas are climate related hazards. So changes in annual temperature and extreme heat events, because we are in the Sacramento Valley and that's a big issue for us. And then changes in precipitation and flooding. The third focus area is related to how the global and statewide trends in transportation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will actually affect the city's fiscal health. So looking at more of our fiscal resilience as a city, specifically regarding gas taxes and vehicle related sales tax city.
Elk Grove is particularly reliant on gas and vehicle related sales tax, with about 30% of our public works operation maintenance funds coming from gas tax and Measure A sales tax. And then vehicle related sales tax makes up about 15% of our general fund revenue. So as trends shift to increasing electric vehicles, and as we look at reducing vehicle miles traveled, to meet our CAP targets, we needed to figure out how the city's revenue declines in these areas, are going to be able to be sort of met at the same time as our population is expected to continue to increase. So how can we sort of balance those 2 things? So the plan development and implementation, which I'll talk about in just a minute, was supported quite a bit by regional collaboration. So we, as a city, are a member of the Climate Region, the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative. And so we drew on a number of members from that group to support this work with working groups organized around the 3 different topics. So as I mentioned, we had strategies developed across different areas. So we sort of grouped them into these 7 different topics areas. We had about 39 different strategies we identified in the document, but we also really wanted to ensure that we were focusing on implementation as we developed the document. So for each strategy we identified, we have a discussion around implementation. It was treated a little bit differently for fiscal than for the 2 climate-related ones. So you'll see sort of over here is what our fiscal looks like, and for each specific strategy we have, here's how that can be implemented. And then for our climate-related strategies, we included for each one sort of the implementation mechanism. What, was that a programmatic? Is that an evaluation, outreach? Is it updating our regulations or our policies or ordinances, that sort of thing? Which is the responsible department for that within the city, but then also regional partners or local organizations that we can reach out to help in supporting that as we implement that. And we also looked at a timeline, right? We, would like to undertake many of these right away, but there's cost realities to implementation. So we looked at phasing, and that phasing was based on when the climate change impacts were most likely to occur. So some of the ones related to flooding and increases in precipitation are a little bit longer time horizon than the heat related ones. But then we also looked at how long a particular strategy might take before it reaches full impact. So for example, with a number of our heat related strategies, they were seen as needing to be implemented sooner, partly because we're already experiencing those high heat events, but also things like, increasing tree planting throughout the city for urban greening needs more time to really reach full maturity and full potential for mitigation. And so we considered that when we were looking at the timeline for phasing in these different strategies. So for the climate-related strategies, we also did a cost estimate, which is not really intended to be an exact indicator of this is how much it will cost to implement the strategy, but really is intended to provide a scale and magnitude for us, so that as we look at these interventions and these strategies, we can have an understanding of what could be more economically done, what can be done with just staff resources, and wouldn't necessarily need to be undertaken with external consultants or external contractors, and which ones are, going to need more financial planning because they're going to be more costly. So we also looked at some of the strategies being cross-cutting, and so you can implement them together, which makes them a little bit more cost efficient. And then also look at where we could implement some along with existing programs in terms of just adjusting how we are considering those projects. And so looking at realizing the resilience plan would not be all additive funding, but we could look at how this could also be using existing, replacing, repurposing funds in different ways so that we can just make it a little bit more reasonable in terms of the cost of what these things will how much it will take to implement them. We, of course, did also have a section on various funding opportunities, many of which Nikki mentioned in terms of the various grant opportunities, different ways that we can look at external funds for these as well. We also, as part of the plan, created a task force intended to support implementation. So this is made up of, we have residents on it, we have local and regional partner organizations, our local SMUD, our regional energy provider. We have a number of nonprofits who've been part of that, so we are looking at this task force to help support the implementation of the strategies through expertise, through focus on specific areas that they may have, bringing in environmental justice and that perspective onto that implementation task force and also help with public outreach. The city also, for the first time, is getting a Civic Sparks Fellow, and so I will push that as well. Like Nikki mentioned, the Civic Sparks Fellow is going to work on helping with implementation of several of the strategies, focusing on those that really involve community engagement. We found as we were developing our plan that it was difficult to engage residents. This was partly because we started our public engagement around February, March of 2020, which was not the time you wanted to be doing public engagement. But, you know, we also found that the topic is one that is a little bit more challenging for residents to really understand. How will it directly impact them, and how, you know, will it immediately, right? They're much more likely to engage around a project that might be building a road or a park or something like that right near their neighborhood, but having this understanding of resilience and why that is important and why they should be involved is a little bit more challenging. So we are really looking at focusing our task force and our Civic Sparks Fellow on that outreach and engagement to ensure we better educate residents on the topic. And with that, I will say, you know, at the bottom of the slide, you can see the webpage for where you can find our plan. We have a nice story map that goes along with it. And with that, I will finish my part and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And with that, we'll move on to our next speaker, Darby Berry. She is the program manager with the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative Network. Darby, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm just trying to figure out how to get to my screen here. I normally have two screens operating, so trying to figure that one out. I think this is where we want to go. Not sure if it's working for me here today.
I can always pull up your slides as well.
Yeah, let's do that, because I keep clicking on it and it's not going.
Strange. Okay, just one moment, everyone.
I am also on a different laptop today because working from home issues, you have a tech issue to send it in. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being patient with me. My name is Darby Berry, she, her, my pronouns, and I am from the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. So I will wait for Taylor here.
If it makes you feel any better, Darby, I am having both internet issues and computer issues. My computer charger is not working, so now I'm switching over to my personal computer.
Yeah, it's I'm on the opposite. I'm on my work computer, and I almost never present from here because I usually have issues. So here we go. That's normal. So thank you for that sentiment, Nikki. I appreciate it, and also apologize for your issues. So again, I'm from the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. I'm going to talk today about regional approaches for advancing adaptation, and just wanted to highlight some of the work that we've been doing in the San Diego region. So next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Climate Collaborative Network here in California, we are a member of the ARCA network, so the Alliance for Regional Climate Collaboratives for Adaptation. But in the San Diego region, we've been around for about 10 years. We started in 2011. We actually just celebrated our decade of impact. So I linked the report in there. I'd love to share it with all of you. But our mission in the San Diego region is pretty simple. It's to advance climate change solutions that both mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. We envision a region that moves forward together, which is prosperous and resilient. So we focus our program areas kind of in 4 different areas around energy efficiency, water, equity, coastal resilience, and all of that with a lens of adaptation lately. So next slide, please. So back in 2018, the San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG, our regional metropolitan planning agency, received SB1 grant funding, and SDRCC was a sub-award on this grant to conduct a regional adaptation needs assessment. So for this adaptation needs assessment, we interviewed about 65 stakeholders from across our region in 2 sets of interviews. So the first round was interviewees from regional cities and agencies, so city planners. We interviewed folks from our port and our airport areas just to look at, what are the core barriers for you to advancing adaptation in the region. And then we also interviewed a second slot of people, and this was our local CDOs, and different diverse kind of climate sectors. So, our wildfire response teams, different water planning agencies, as well as our equity-based environmental CBOs and environmental justice organizations. So I just wanted to highlight, this was about 2019 when we conducted this work, and not a lot of these needs have changed. I think there are also probably things that are felt, across regions, which is why I wanted to highlight them. So about 70% of our individuals highlighted that access to technical assistance and new climate planning data is definitely a need for them. Greater access to funding opportunities. I know I'm always banging on a door with that one. And then, one of the bigger pieces was this, 52% of folks kind of felt that their staffing and capacity were really large inhibitors to being able to advance adaptation planning at the scale and speed that, their cities needed. But then, it kind of shifted a little bit when we looked at, mostly our environmental justice organizations and kind of our diverse climate leaders, increased funding opportunities as their greatest need. And a lot of this revolved around increased funding to collaborate with our cities more specifically. A lot of them said, about 60%, that there's a lack of awareness around how they can be involved and also be supportive to our cities and agencies in their work. So, really trying to bridge this gap between who's able to do what and who wants to do what too, as well. And then same thing, about 50% of them said that their staffing and capacity really prevents their, advancement. So next slide, please. So just at a high level, just wanted to overview, in the San Diego region, we're focused really, so for the Climate Collaborative, this, highlighted the areas that we could be really supportive to our cities and agencies who are our members of, how can we provide our capacity for staffing and technical expertise to fill some of these gaps. A lot of the work, looking at project funding was actually around full project lifespan funding. So, some of our cities and agencies are kind of either stuck, they've done the planning, they've done the assessment, but they can't get to implementation. And some of them don't want to move forward with implementation unless they can secure those post-implementation monitoring dollars. And I know when we get to that phase 4 in the APG planning, the price tag ticket for implementation is much higher than these other phases. So there's also that factor as well to think about. One of the things that we're working on here and what we heard, from our members for the Climate Collaborative support is this increased appetite for pilot and experimental projects. The field of adaptation is really changing and it's advancing, kind of with all of us as practitioners within it. So, we don't necessarily know what's going to be the best for our region. We know what science says is probably going to work, but without having these projects and pilots, as well as, a monitoring system to track their success, we really just don't know. And so having that increased appetite for experiment and design is really important here. And then also streamline guidance for navigating regulatory policies. So this one was big, really trying to look at how we can both cut through the green tape, get different projects aligned, but also more importantly, how can we build adaptation into projects that are already underway? How can we build adaptation into our traditional thinking around mitigation in different projects as well, and really build that guidance in a streamlined manner? as well as just building community engagement and support for nature-based solutions, figuring out what those solutions are in our region, and how we can be, supportive to advancing them and bridging some of those conversations. Next slide. So this was a big one that I just, wanted to highlight was, this problem with this funding feedback loop. So, why adaptation takes so much longer than maybe it should is, this access to funding and opportunities. Once you finally get through that hurdle, then you realize you're in a space where you need more technical assistance, you need expertise. Maybe your city doesn't have that on staff. You're a small city with, 2 planners. And so you're trying to figure that out. So you hire a consultant and you finally secure project funding. And then you need more technical assistance. And then you need to do a new feasibility study. You need funding for CEQA, so you're consistently stuck kind of in these loops before you really get to that enabling adaptation opportunities. And then, left off of this slide is then the implementation of that. So just wanted to highlight that that's really been a really big hurdle for us in the San Diego region. And I'm sure others share that as well. Next slide, please. And then, one new thing that really came out of this that we've, been working on that I'll highlight is really prioritizing equity. And so, building community resilience requires prioritizing this. If our, communities who are already most vulnerable are left out of the planning process and left out of the adaptation process, we are not going to become resilient as either a region or a community until all of our communities are resilient. And, it's one thing to also acknowledge the space of it's a privilege to plan to adapt, right? Some of our most vulnerable communities are consistently adapting to the changing climate, changing impacts and vulnerabilities that they experience. So, really acknowledging that space that, we can provide. As well as making sure that equity is integrated throughout. Equity should be a ground up approach throughout this planning process. So in addition to that first study that I talked about, SANDAG was also awarded another round of SB1 funding to build off of the needs assessment to really look at this piece in particular. And SDRCC has been supporting that work again. So we're, in the process of working with our partners at SANDAG on developing an equity guidance document for adaptation. So really excited for that to come out here in November and December. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight, one of the things that we work on at the Climate Collaborative is really building bridges and trying to approach things from a regional lens, as well as being supportive to our larger regional agencies. Like I mentioned, that great partnership with SANDAG around how we can advance this regional mindset. I'm sure many of us know that climate doesn't care, where municipal boundaries end. So, if one city is planning in a really robust, resilient way and their neighbors are not, they're really going to be feeling those impacts all around. So really making sure that we're all planning in alignment and together in a way that's going to be beneficial and create some opportunities for collaboration, multi-benefits, and maybe even cross-city and cross-municipality funding opportunities. And one of the things that we can do as the Climate Collaborative being a regional partner is really also building that multi-sector influence. So building up the opportunities with philanthropy, building up the opportunities with our business and CBO sector to really create those interlocking opportunities for regional approaches. And thinking about our whole space as a region moving together towards advancing action. Next slide, please. And so, some of these opportunity areas that, we're taking head on right now as an agency is this community planning and communicating long-term risk. So we're working on a grant right now to really create kind of a toolkit for specifically our community leaders. So, our elected officials in understanding the cost of inaction and why, even though that big ticket price tag on adaptation projects is actually a really inexpensive one when you think about the cost of inaction in the long term on the impacts on our communities, as well as innovative financing for adaptation solutions. So figuring out how to fund that whole project pathway from planning to implementation all through the 4 phases. As well as implementing long-term learning. So partnering with our other, academia and resources in the region to, create kind of a toolkit for, creating a regulatory monitoring system, as well as, like I mentioned, strengthening regional governments and cutting the regulatory tape. So what can we work on, as a region to prioritize these projects for implementation in order to move forward together? And next slide, please. So like I mentioned, I just wanted to highlight these projects again. SDRCC in partnership with SANDAG is developing an equity guidance document for adaptation. In addition to that, as part of that project as well, that I didn't include here, some of our partners are also looking at economic guidance document. So, what kind of opportunities should cities be taking into place, both with equity and financial decisions? SDRCC is a core member of the newly launched California Resilience Partnership led by Resilient Cities Catalyst. So, looking to grow our opportunities within our region itself, but also across the state of California, and learning best practices from our partners around the state. We've also received OPC funding to do this regional coastal resilience roadmap that I mentioned. And we, lead monthly working groups and dialogues to address these challenges as a region. So, just building that capacity to have those dialogues within your region is really what we're here to do and here to support. So wanted to share that. And next slide, please. I think that's it. Yes, thank you so much. So I'll stop there. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. And I saw that Katie Hendrick from SANDAG is here. Katie worked very closely with us on that needs assessment project, so she can also answer any of those questions as well. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Darby, for that really wonderful overview. We will be moving to our last speaker, Brian Strong and Kate Faust. Brian is the Chief Resilience Officer and Director of the Office of Resilience at the City of San Francisco, and Kate Faust is a Senior Analyst with the Office of Resilience and Capital Planning at the City of San Francisco.
Yeah, hi everyone. I hope you can see me okay. Thanks so much for having us. My name is Brian Strong. Kate, I think, are you going to share the presentation? Yeah, there it is. We appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you. I am the Chief Resilience Officer and the Director of the Office of Resilience and Capital Planning. And, I thought both Carrie and Darby did a great job talking about what they're doing in their various jurisdictions and how we should be thinking about regional climate resilience. It's something we've been thinking about in San Francisco for a long time. If we can go to the next slide, Kate. And what I will do is give a broad overview, and then Kate will sort of jump into how we fund and try to move some of these projects forward, kind of building on what Darby was talking about, the funding feedback loop. It's sort of the way that we're addressing that funding feedback loop. And that also includes incorporating equity and some of those other features. We know we can't have resilience without equity. They're intertwined. So we're going to give some examples of what we're doing in San Francisco that we hope will spur some ideas and comments from people. So just to let you know, we have a multi-year 10-year capital plan. It's been really focused on resilience ever since the beginning, before resilience was such a catchy type of term. It was started in 2006. In 2016, we merged it with our resilience, our Office of Resilience. So now we have the two offices are combined, where we're really linking financing and funding with our resilience efforts and looking across the entire city with those. That was our Resilient SF plan, and we actually worked with 100 resilient cities. We were one of the cities selected to do that, and that actually led to the team that Darby was referring to that now are doing the Resilient Cities Catalyst. There's also the Resilient Cities Network, which is cities, 30 cities in the US, 35 cities in the US, and then I think another 50 cities across the world that are working on these same type of issues, having the same discussions that we're talking about today. So our office, we focus a lot on policy and bringing people together, as well as developing a plan of finance. If we go to the next slide, these are a set of the three major material that we put together and we're following up on. One is that Resilient SF program I mentioned. It came out in 2016. The other is our Hazards and Climate Resilience Plan. This is really our local hazard mitigation plan, our LHMP. This relates to SB 379, and certainly we worked with Governor's Office of Planning and Research and other folks on how to make this work, how to make sure we're including resilience and equity into our capital plan. And this is also feeding into a lot of the other planning work that's happening around the city. We have 97 strategies around how to make San Francisco more resilient that are identified in this plan that's FEMA required and updated every 5 years. And then we have a plan that was developed with a lot of community input and support. It came out in 2010, 2011. It's a 30-year plan to address seismic safety. That has been a big feature of our office, and now we're really sort of transitioning to make sure you're not just doing seismic work, but now you're also doing climate change work and sea level rise work and heat mitigation work and all those things that bring in climate resilience. Next slide. So this shows some of the interagency work that we're doing. So in the middle of San Francisco there on this map, we have the Hazard and Climate Resilience Plan, which is looking at all hazards. We have our climate action strategy, which is coming out in June, which focuses on greenhouse gas reduction and various mitigation and adaptation strategies there. We've done a lot of work. Again, we have sea level rise guidance that is required for all capital projects over $5 million. They have to ensure that they're addressing, that their project is able to address sea level rise. We're doing work around Ocean Beach, which actually involves moving away from the shore to some extent. There's a lot of work around our waterfront resilience plan and around the seawall in San Francisco, which I will mention briefly at the end of the presentation. And then we have a lot of place-based resilience work too. Islas Creek in the Bayview area, the Tenderloin, Chinatown. Those are all very vulnerable communities to flooding and to various and heat impacts, as well as liquefaction and earthquakes. So we're trying to do work that focuses on those specific areas of the city. Next slide. This really, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk about our capital plan and how we think about moving the financing that goes with these projects forward.
Thanks, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, can everyone hear me? I'm unmuted, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So one of the central responsibilities of our office is the development of the city's 10-year capital plan. The plan is a fiscally constrained expenditure plan that lays out anticipated infrastructure investments over the next decade. So in April, the city adopted the fiscal 22 to 31 capital plan, which recommends $38 billion in critical infrastructure investments over the next 10 years. This plan also includes some significant updates, including affordable housing service area, which we added for the first time, as well as new investments that focus on economic recovery, specifically from the COVID pandemic, and resilience with a renewed focus on racial equity specifically. So here is just a summary of all the funding sources that we identified across the city's service areas. And I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but I'll just note that although we added the new affordable housing service area, which includes about $2.6 billion in investments, the total sources across all areas is about $1 billion less than our last plan. And that's really due to the impact that COVID had on our general fund, as well as the revenue sources that enterprise departments depend on, like SFO and MTA. And another contributing factor is just the amount of debt that we were able to issue since the last plan, which reduces our projected debt capacity looking forward. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a few slides. So the capital plan reflects our efforts to balance these limited resources with the city's most pressing needs. The investments identified in the plan are prioritized with a focus on emerging stronger from COVID-19 and building equitable resilience to future anticipated shocks and stresses that the city will face. The funding principles for the capital plan are the categories that we use to make trade-offs between these competing needs. So we prioritize projects that address legal or regulatory mandates, protect life safety and enhance resilience, and that includes racial equity, ensure asset preservation and sustainability, address programmatic and planned needs, and support economic development. So as a funding principle, the focus on resilience requires that we prioritize investments that build racial and social equity, tackle affordability challenges, increase climate resilience and seismic safety, and then continue to take care of the infrastructure that we already have, as well as invest in systems that will need to meet future resilience challenges. So in the capital plan that we've just adopted, we reflect these priorities and recommended investments for community health centers, in digital equity projects, affordable housing, investments at Ocean Beach that Brian mentioned earlier, various heat mitigation projects, seismic retrofits, as well as the seawall. So as I mentioned earlier, our general obligation bond capacity has decreased just because of the levels of debt that were passed at the ballot over the last 2 years. So we were able to issue 1.7 billion in bonds since the last capital plan. So that includes the affordable housing bond, the earthquake safety and emergency response bond, as well as the most recent health and recovery bond that just passed in November. Over the next decade, the city's capital plan recommends 125 million in general fund debt, which is focused really on economic stimulus and an equitable recovery from the pandemic, as well as GO bonds that are planned for transportation, public health, and affordable housing in the near term. The other key component for our strategy to an equitable recovery is the emphasis on racial equity. And that's really in our capital plan as well as the capital budget. So I will talk about what that looks like in both of those places. So this year is the first year that we issued a racial equity survey to general fund departments through the capital budget process. The objectives of the survey were really just to provide kind of a year one baseline that we could measure change against. We wanted to go beyond the kind of checking the box strategy that we had really been using previously and ask departments to incorporate racial equity analysis into their capital planning efforts and then be able to communicate the benefits of that work. So the survey results really helped us prioritize projects for funding, but also are helping inform how we can best support departments moving forward in their racial equity work. So for budget requests, we asked departments 4 questions about each project. What populations are benefited and how will you know if projects have been successful? What populations have been negatively impacted and what are the strategies to mitigate negative impacts? What does the department use in terms of disaggregated data disaggregated by race to inform budget requests? And does the department request support the department's racial equity plan or a racial equity strategy? So in the capital plan, we focus the near-term COP debt schedule on advancing racial equity, resilience, and the need for economic stimulus, as well as addressing some of the PAYGO funding gaps that we're facing. The recovery stimulus funding that you see here in fiscal 22 and fiscal 23, at the 50 million level and the $75 million level, these funds are really intended to move significant shovel-ready projects forward to have an economic stimulus impact and to help us address some of our most pressing resilience challenges. So I will get a little bit more into that funding process. So the recovery stimulus projects will be highly visible investments that stimulate employment and deliver co-benefits. By addressing not only resilience goals, but also promoting equity in the city's service delivery. Oops, sorry. So all of the projects that are considered for recovery stimulus funding have been identified in the capital plan and have completed necessary advanced planning in order to be in construction within 18 months of this new fiscal year. The funded projects will be significant enhancements that we typically can't accommodate in the cash budget. And funded projects will deliver additional co-benefits. So those could include supporting access to basic needs for vulnerable populations, promoting racial equity in service delivery or economic justice, reducing climate and other hazard risks like earthquakes, flooding, poor air quality, supporting affordable housing or shelter assets, and or supporting small business activity. And in addition to the general fund debt, we also have the general obligation bond schedule that I've talked about a bit before. So all I'll really say for this slide is that you can see that we're utilizing all of the bond capacity that we currently have available. The red line you see there represents the property tax limit, and that sets the annual level of bond debt repayment. And the space between the red line and the bars in the chart illustrates the projected capacity for bond debt each year. So this source, like all of our sources, is constrained, and we use the same kind of funding priorities and strategies to make the necessary trade-offs and identify funding priorities. So with that, Brian, do you want to talk about our finance strategy for the seawall?
Yeah, and I'll just as a follow-up, and those constraints have been really helpful to us in, we have an extremely high bond rating, AAA bond rating, and it's also been really helpful with constituents, either voters or members of our board of supervisors or community members who want to understand how we're funding or why we're funding things, and how it fits into the overall financial health of the city. And I think that's just one thing I want to emphasize with folks today. I know there are a lot of planners on the call, is making sure that you have really good relationships with your folks that are doing your financing and your capital budgeting and those forth. And those types of issues, be sure you're speaking with them early and often, and get them engaged as soon as possible. We also have funds to sort of do pre-development finance work or pre-development project work. It's not a lot, it's a revolving fund, but it's something that we've set up. And when you issue bonds, you can replenish that fund. So that's been really immensely helpful. The seawall, I'm just going to quickly mention, because I know we're just about out of time. This is a large project. It's a $5 billion project. We worked with the community. We worked with a number of finance people to look at how can we fund something as large as a seawall that's impacts the city in so many ways, not just from an equity perspective, but also just from the ability to function. It's where all of our major utilities come through. So really what we did is we identified sort of these three different buckets. The primary buckets are the ones that would bring in significant dollars, but we know that it's also important to have these secondary and supplementary buckets that are smaller. So we did pass a $410 million GEO bond, I think in 2018, to start to work on this. It was the first time we've spent significant GEO bonds on a climate resilience project, I would say, or specifically climate resilience project. We are looking at issuing community facilities districts. We're looking at working with the state. We're working closely with the Army Corps of Engineers, which brings with it a whole host of issues and challenges. But it's an opportunity for us to pull in some significant dollars. And then secondary, again, these may be smaller amounts, whether it's a sales tax increase or whether it's looking at tourism, TOT, transit occupancy taxes or tourism taxes, but it is something that we think can also be helpful. And then the supplementary are some of the things we've also talked about, which is whether or not you have public-private partnerships public-private partnerships, philanthropic money, cruise ticket revenue. These are things that are probably not going to raise significant amounts of money, but they are important to putting together the entire funding picture and to making it clear that everyone has a stake and everyone has to participate in a project like this. So with that, I think it's right at 12 o'clock. We're happy to take any questions if people are able to stay on, and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Brian and Kate. So we have about 30 minutes left. So definitely a substantial chunk of time for question and answer. I think we will do the first 15 minutes with.
I thought we were done at 12. I shouldn't have spoken so fast. All right. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I know at least I would love to hear more about the seawall, but we can hand it over to attendees for their question and answer right now. And then for the 15 minutes following the question and answer, we can open up the floor maybe to speak more about the mentee exercise at the beginning, and leave room for attendees to kind of share their experiences in this space as well. So we'll begin with question and answer. Feel free to send any questions in the chat or to raise your hand. We also have some questions for our panelists as well. We recognize this can be a sensitive topic for folks, or maybe people would like to send questions directly to the hosts. Feel free to send them to myself, and we can also get them answered anonymously. I am going to hand the mic to Sydney Short, the ICARP intern, who will ask the first few questions.
Great. So our first question, in Carrie's presentation, she mentioned the phasing approach of implementation, where strategies were prioritized based on climate projection data and current climate impacts. Carrie, what resources were helpful for your office as you gathered this data and made these decisions? Also would love to hear from other panelists about the factors that contributed most to implementation decisions and ranking strategies.
Thank you. So we actually, I think I mentioned we had working groups around each of the 3 different topic areas that included, residents, but also included a lot of different regional partners with a lot of knowledge in this area. We relied heavily, as I mentioned, on our climate readiness collaborative partners. And so when in some of the sessions we did with those working groups, we really looked at, with these strategies, what makes sense in terms of that phasing, and then sort of also worked with our own internal public works staff, with our internal finance department, to sort of say what is reasonable, right? Sometimes when we have external folks helping with it, everything becomes a priority, and we of course can't end up doing everything at once. So it was really an iterative process to figure out that phasing, to sort of propose and discuss with our working groups and readjust and look at those. So it took some time with our working group to figure out the best phasing that we did. And what we even have in the document, we realize is likely going to be adjusted some, as different opportunities may come up for funding, a strategy that maybe we thought of doing later, but the opportunity is now, we'll make those adjustments. Does that help sort of provide some answer?
Yes, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to jump in and add anything to that before we move on to the next question? Okay, so our next question is for Brian and Kate. How common is it for cities to incorporate resilience into their fiscal planning in the way that San Francisco is doing? I would guess that SF is more advanced in incorporating resilience into long-term fiscal planning than many other local jurisdictions.
I don't know that I have a, I mean, I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I mean, because we certainly have looked at a number of different jurisdictions that are doing this work or that are doing similar work. And in some ways, people have been doing it for a long time. Like I said, before resilience came around, it was coined resilience. It was more about, okay, seismic safety. And after some of the large earthquakes that we've had, or that other jurisdictions in California have, they've made investments. And certainly there have been similar efforts and programs going around. I mean, I'm really interested to hear what Elk Grove is doing. It sounds like they're doing a lot of work, and now beginning to incorporate it into your budget and financing structure is sort of the next step. Certainly places like Miami and Miami-Dade, or some of those areas where they've been hit sort of repeatedly with climate change type disasters over and over again, they've actually advanced a lot of this work quite a bit too. Clearly, New York after Superstorm Sandy. I guess the difference is that in many situations, jurisdictions are sort of, where the money comes after the event, and that happened in New York. That certainly happened in New Orleans. those larger federal dollars tend to only come after you have a big, after something happens, and then the money can pour in. We really need to be working with the federal level, and I know there's a number of bills at the state level now too, to get some of this money earlier, to get money available for planning. I think this gets to your previous question about doing vulnerability analysis and those types of things. Those can be challenging and they take time, especially if you want to work with community like we want to. They take time to do, they take resources, and you know, I'm hopeful. I do believe that more and more jurisdictions are doing this work. You know, and even with San Francisco, it kind of feels early that we're finally really emphasizing equity, like Kate said, as opposed to just sort of having it be a check the box thing, that we're really going to start looking at real measures and real outcomes. And I think we're going to want to do the same thing with the climate resilience funding measures.
Great, thank you. So moving on to our next question. Carrie mentioned it can be challenging to educate residents about climate adaptation and get them involved in the process. And Darby emphasized the importance of creating a toolkit and communicating the cost of inaction. What strategies have panelists found most useful for communicating about climate change solutions and climate adaptation planning?
Yeah, I can jump into this first, since the collaborative really, provides an opportunity for, cities to tell us what's lacking for them. It also, creates an opportunity for us to be that external facing agency to make those conversations and connections. And, I think one thing that came up for myself and others who are working on that adaptation needs assessment project was, a clear definition for adaptation is often lacking, and understanding, what exactly do we mean when we say adaptation? And I think, one space for opportunity in helping to bridge that conversation is figuring out ways where we can talk about how sometimes adaptation solutions are also mitigation solutions that help our cities meet their CAP goals, how these projects really have strong interconnections and overlapping. And so thinking about also, the term resilience and what does that mean for our communities? And recently we've had these conversations with some of our, community and CBO facing environmental justice groups of, the way that they use the term adaptation and resilience is very much grounded in justice. And sometimes the way that we talk about adaptation and resilience from a planning perspective is, more long-term, broad, and thinking about, people, places, and movement. So I think, trying to define a shared narrative, within the community spaces that you're working has been really critical for us to start bridging those conversations and, more importantly, building trust. Because when you're trying to get robust community engagement and understanding, using words in the same exact way is always very critical. And so I think, also talking about the long-term implications of some of these, planning for climate adaptation and some of the previous implications of planning and how it's impacted communities in the past is really important when you want to bring climate into that space as well and building those gaps there.
Yeah, I would just follow up with that and say, completely agree with everything you're saying, Darby. We in doing our hazard mitigation plan or our climate hazards and climate resilience plan, we did a lot of outreach to community. Typically, when those plans were done before, they were, again, it was fairly quick. A lot of it was focused on emergency response. People think FEMA, they think emergency response. They're not really thinking about these sort of long-term implications. And I think that the ability to relate your plan and to go to where people are, right? The expectation that we can just go to a certain neighborhood and provide them with 2,000 trees and they'll be thrilled to have them and they're going to want to put them in front of all their houses to help reduce heat impacts is unrealistic when these neighbors are dealing with other issues, and when they don't want that responsibility. So I think that type of sensitivity is really important. When we did our outreach for the hazards and climate resilience plan, a lot of what we heard from communities is that they just wanted the city to level set with them. They wanted to have the same access to data that the city has. And that was that was really, I think, helpful to us and sort of spurred us to try to be a lot more transparent with the information that we have in that plan. So we created a story map of our own, where people can go in and community members can go in and they can actually identify the hazards that their community is facing. They can turn maps on and off to be able to see that. And, you know, this all happened right before COVID, but our intent is to take this plan and to continue to go out and talk to people about it and just be honest that, yeah, we don't have answers to all these issues. But these are what we're working on, and what kind of feedback can you provide us? So I'll pop that link in the chat if I get a chance, if people are interested in looking at that story map. I do think it's helpful.
And we did do, once our plan was approved, we did do a story map as well to try and share information. I think it's been a little bit difficult for us over, you know, COVID has not made it easy to do that engagement and reaching out to communities that, you know, virtual may not work. And especially, you know, I think the last 6-8 months, you know, people got tired of all the virtual at the beginning of COVID, and so haven't been as, you know, willing or excited to jump on to another virtual, you know, as maybe they were, you know, being able to do it from their home early on. So it has been a challenge, and we're looking forward to being able to really interact with people again in person. You know, as things start to open and things start to change, we're really looking at opportunities where already people are coming together, right? And so can we use those events to go out and help educate the public about this, right? So rather than setting up a separate event to talk about resilience and trying to get people there, using some of our farmers markets, using some of our neighborhood association meetings, using some of the, we have, you know, a diversity and inclusion festival every year. We have, you know, various different events where we can go there and you have people showing up and you can figure out how to then engage with them where they are. And so we're really excited about being able to do that this year and into next year as things start to open again.
Great, so we have a few more moments before jumping into discussion. So I'll just pose one last question for any of the panelists. Darby outlined the importance of funding, full lifespan funding for projects. What are some tips and best practices for identifying financing mechanisms that can span the project?
That is like the golden ticket question, Sydney. And I'm not sure if any of us can totally answer that, but I will talk about, you know, one of the great things that we're working on in partnership with the Resilient Cities Catalyst is looking at how we can make some of these projects and opportunities more appealing for philanthropy to kind of, you know, be an innovative financing solution for filling in the gaps, and how we can, you know, establish different levels of funding mechanisms that, you know, can be regionally solidified for us to kind of move projects along. But, you know, when it comes to the long-term pieces, I think really emphasizing the importance when it comes to upcoming funding from the state level is emphasizing the importance of, you know, O&M on the end of an implementation grant and not having these phases be separate. I think having, you know, strict full lifestyle funding that cities aren't constantly pulling together their resources to apply to these grant after grant system. You know, and one of the other conversations we had that maybe is helpful for folks is, you know, who are you planning for and who are you planning to, right? If you're writing a grant and you're using NOAA's framework, for example, for, you know, the particular project that you're planning, but then you want to go for FEMA brick funding later, you know, the plan that you did isn't matching some of the, you know, regulatory requirements of that funding. So really creating this streamlined pathway for cities not to be jumping around and piecemealing that work together. Because if we think about the math of like how much staff time it takes for cities to pull together these unsuccessful proposals, because we know that 90% of the time they're going to be, no one submits a proposal with the atmosphere of like, I'm totally going to get this. It's like, maybe be great, but like, broken hearts is definitely a thing. So I don't have a big answer, but I will say I think we need to be smarter from a state level of making it mandatory within our financing mechanisms.
I would just say it's more of a, it's more of a smorgasbord than a menu. And you really need to look at all your different options and then find somewhere you can really commit the dollars to it. And you got to get the political will and the commitment to it. And you got to get the ability to say, we're going to move forward with this with or without the funding. The issue with some of the FEMA grants and so forth is they can also take a year to a year. We had a couple that were 18 months before we heard if we got the grant. We were already halfway through the project when they finally got back to us. So I think it's important to have mechanisms that you can finance yourselves to move projects forward. I mentioned we have this sort of capital planning fund. There are, right now, a lot of folks, the state came up with excess revenue. When you get some of those one-time revenues, create a revolving fund or something that you can use to do some of this work. And then I do think you have to, these projects are large, they're complex. You're going to have to go after a number of different sources. You certainly should be smart in what you're applying for and try to be coordinated. But it's, that's the big, that's kind of the holy grail that we're all going after is, okay, how can you get the money to do this work? And like we said, there are so many different projects, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, and we've tended to provide more funding for mitigation than for adaptation. So there's maybe a little bit more challenge there, but how can you convert some of those existing projects that you talked about earlier today from a single hazard to multi-hazard? How can you, take a project and make it better? So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your questions and the panelists for all of your wonderful answers. I will now pass it back to Taylor Carnevale to introduce the discussion portion.
Perfect. So we were hoping for the next 2 minutes, if any folks wanted to raise their hand and share experiences or elaborate on topics verbally, we'd like to invite you to do so as well. We also are open to sharing in the chat. So yeah, we'll open the floor now and give it a couple minutes. And then the other side of this coin, recognizing that this is our last adaptation planning guide webinar, is what webinars would be helpful for you in the future coming from ICARP? What can we start working on to provide more resources for you? So if you would like, feel free to add that in the chat or again to raise your hand, and then we will move into closing remarks. Wonderful. Okay, so if you do have any ideas or there are any comments you'd like to include, feel free to email our team. Our contacts are on here. And before we close, we'd like to provide a really important announcement from the ICARP manager, Juliet Hart. Juliet, are you?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you hear your screen? Perfect.
Can you hear me? Hi everyone. Just a quick plug. If you have it in you for another webinar, we are doing the state adaptation strategy update. So this is the big guiding document at the state level that points us all in the same direction on climate adaptation. We have our kickoff webinar tonight. So I've just put the chat for the registration. I just put the link for the registration in the chat. And so tonight is the kickoff webinar where we will talk about what we're headed towards. And then throughout the month of June, we're holding regional workshops across the state where this is where we really want to hear from you about what you're working on. What are your regional priorities? What are you concerned about? What are your adaptation efforts? Where are your challenges? Where are the opportunities? This will help us as we shape the state adaptation strategy, which will then get drafted up and put back out for comment and review in August. So we're moving really quickly on it, but we have the whole month of June set aside to really slow down, go through all the regions, listen to what you all are doing. We really, really would love to have you attend. So I've put the first chat that sorry, I keep doing that. The first link that I put in the chat up there is the registration for tonight's kickoff webinar. And then I'm going to follow up right now with another link that leads you to a page that shows all the different dates. Next week, we have Sacramento Valley, Northern Sierra, and Southern Sierra, and then we just kind of are moving all over the state. So please join us. Please help us shape this strategy so it's useful and equitable for everyone. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juliet. There's also a question in the chat about an agenda, if that's available. So just to flag you to that for tonight's kickoff webinar.
Yeah, it's going to be, it's an hour, it's at 4 p.m. And we're going to have a presentation from Nuantara Key, the Director for Climate Resilience, and Amanda Hansen from Resources, Deputy Secretary for Climate. And they're going to walk through the process, and then there'll be some time for a question and answer. So a pretty straightforward webinar.
Awesome. And it looks like we're receiving a couple of ideas for future webinar topics. I see the idea from Emily moving from jurisdiction level planning to collaborative regional planning, and an idea from Lewis, planning for infrastructure assessment across scales needed for future webinars. All great ideas. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this webinar. Thank you all so much for attending. I think this has been a wonderful webinar series, at least for us on the OPR side, to learn as well from everything that's going on at the local level. So hopefully it was just as relevant and useful and helpful to you all. We have our contact information on the slide here, so feel free to email us at any time with questions, with ideas for webinars we can do, resources you need. I encourage you to check out the Adaptation Clearinghouse. I am the Adaptation Clearinghouse manager, so feel free also to submit resources to me, and I'll see about uploading it to the Clearinghouse. We now have some awesome tutorials on how to use the Clearinghouse to find the resources you're looking for, thanks to Sydney Short here on the call. So encourage you to check those out. And I guess I'll just say that thank you all for doing this incredibly important work to make our communities resilient. And I think it's just so important for me always to continually connect back to like my core purpose here. Like, why am I here? Why is this important to me? Sometimes it can be so, it's depressing. It's climate change. It's real people are dying from extreme heat and wildfires, and infrastructure is being demolished, and it's heavy stuff on top of everything else that we're going through. And so for me, and I'm sure for all of you, like continuing to just stay checked into those core reasons why we're all here, core reasons for like why we love doing this work, why we love our communities, the things that we want to preserve about our communities, sharing our own stories with each other and with the people that we're working with. We're all human, and continuing to connect back to that, I think, is really important for our sanity. And so with that, I'll just thank you all, and we can wrap it up.
Thanks, everyone.